All right, as promised, Dart Adams is with us for a second time here on Dome Theory. We talked to him probably just about a year ago, talking about similar things that we're going to talk about today: the erasure of Black Boston, handful of other things back then in that episode. One of my favorite interviews I've done here, and you've really just become one of my favorite follows on Twitter for the history, the music, certainly, as well as the writing you do. Pick up the Book of Dart, his book on hip hop, and the numerous different writings that he's done over the years, as well as check him out in Boston Magazine. He did a story back in March about the experience of being black in Boston, and you have another one coming soon, I hear.
Yeah, so the May issue of Boston Magazine, I have one about the image of Boston and how there's a issue with like how we're represented in Hollywood and film and television.
Mm-hmm.
And I have another piece coming up about like transplants in Boston, and it all stems from the work that I did with the Boston Globe. Janae Osterheld has a series called The Beautiful Resistance, and when we do the video component for that, I do the music, right? But also I was featured in an episode. So after all that happened, people were like, and people started following me on Twitter, and they were like, you need to write about some of these things that you talk about all the time. So, Boston Magazine finally reached out, and, I have my second piece coming up soon. Working on it right now.
So it all fits in so well with what we're going to talk about here, and that's Kyrie Irving, his comments about Boston, the experience of playing in Boston, and see, like it's so tough for me to grapple
Yeah.
with these comments because it's a very short sentence and just basically a small request. Don't be racist in the crowd, but it has a larger implication and a
Yes.
larger, you know, just meaning there that hit Boston extra hard when it comes to the racial history,
Oh, yeah.
the history of racism in sports in Boston. And you just know, as Kyrie lived here for 2 years and is a smart guy, he understood the significance of saying something like that. So it wasn't just merely a simple request of saying, don't be racist in the crowd. I mean, that would be just a simple thing. And, Jason Tatum today, I asked him about the comment that Kyrie made, and they're obviously close. And that's kind of how he took it. Don't be racist in the crowd. Just a very simple request there. But Boston was really upset about this
Yeah.
as a whole.
Well, yeah. Well, here's the problem, right? Boston hasn't done itself many favors,
Mm-hmm.
right? It kind of dug this hole for itself. Back in February, we did a NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, specifically the Boston chapter. We did a special panel, and I talked about one of the biggest issue with Boston finally addressing its erasure of Black Bostonians, Latino Bostonians, our experience, not our low visibility in media, is that Boston paints itself as this progressive, liberal city that never really faces up to the reality of what it's done and never really openly acknowledges it. They like to say, no, 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 we're not those people, but they've done almost absolutely nothing to, earn people's, giving them the benefit of the doubt. And that's where things, that's where we have the issue. And also the thing is that with Kyrie's statement, he could have said that, anybody could have said that about any crowd in the NBA or any crowd of a team that's still in the playoffs, right? Because there are racial incidents with fandoms of all 30 NBA franchises. However, we're only dealing with the ones in the playoffs, and Kyrie Irving can only deal with the one that he's going to face. But Kyrie Irving can specifically deal with the one from a team that he played with in a city that his father played in for 4 years
That's a
and
great
became a
point
Boston legend,
too.
in the
Yes.
city where his parents met, and in a city where he was a free agent and he said that I'll be back if you'll have me. And then he never played in Boston again, or he was injured or something happened where he could not, participate in a game in Boston. And for all these years, he never played here, or after he left, now he says, I just don't want there to be any casual racism, any this and this and that from the crowd. Because you know how it is there. I would have appreciated it if he would have addressed this while he was playing here, or if he played here in Cleveland and had these things happen, or when he became a free agent and came here at some point, said that I would like for the audience, the crowd, to not do X, Y, and Z because that's not how you should treat the players that are the opponent. We players that are on the team see that, we're like, if that's how you feel about them, how do you feel about us? Right?
Yeah.
So at some point, I would have loved for Kyrie to say with his whole chest his feelings about that before now, years after the fact. Not that it's still not valid, and not that that was even the issue I had, but also we knew that by saying this about the Boston audience and the Boston crowd and the city of Boston in particular, that it was going to have wide-ranging effects, because the default setting is hate Boston. And unfortunately for those black and brown Bostonians who are already underrepresented, who are already erased, who are already have low visibility, for us to say anything about our city is going to be met with hyper resistance, because again, the default setting is to hate Boston and hate the Celtics for whatever reason.
It's so interesting because, like you say, it's a valid point, and that's something you can't deny. So you have three layers to this. There are people who hear this and are like, I've never heard this in Boston. I've never dealt with this. Like Danny Ainge today.
Oh.
Not great. Not great comments from Danny Ainge on the radio. I've been here 26 years and I've never heard this. Like, tone deaf on top of numerous other issues with that. And you got people.
You got people.
Yes, and you got people calling into the radio, and I was listening to it yesterday, and like one of them said Kyrie's the real racist, and just like this resistance to even the existence of racism is something we deal with, and doesn't help Boston in its fight against this, certainly. Look, to have that level of pushback. There's other layers to this too, but that's what sticks out to me first.
Howard Bryant said very eloquently that Boston has dug this hole and they've done nothing to get out of it, right? And by the reaction of Danny Ainge saying, I haven't heard anybody say anything about this 26 years. Well, if you're a black basketball player playing in a hostile environment, this is par for the course for you, right? So it's not likely you're going to go to Danny Ainge and say, I heard racial comments, when it's par for the course for you and it's been something you've experienced pretty much your entire life, whether it's implied, whether it's aggressively said at you, or if it's like an off-the-cuff remark, or if it's a microaggression, right? You experience it so much that why would you go to Danny Ainge and tell him that, right? But also it shows how tone deaf Danny Ainge is, that he didn't realize that in the 26 years he's been in Boston, that this is definitely something that happens and likely happens every day, because one of my favorite place in the world is Fenway Park. But I got to tell you, I am on hyper alert for anybody saying anything slightly racist around me, my family, my friends, or in my immediate area. They will get seen and dealt with immediately.
Yes.
Right? But for Danny Ainge to say that 26 years in Boston, I've heard nobody say this. Well, one, do they have to say it to you for you to know that it exists? Do they have to tell you that it happened for you to exist? For you to know it exists? And people on Twitter were saying, what about what Marcus Smart said? I read the first time Marcus Smart said it. I've seen Marcus Smart before. You know, I know this happens. So for you to say that like you're owning me or something like that, it's like, I know this happens. You know, it's not me denying it. I would never deny that happens. I'm a black Bostonian, have been for 45 years. Are you stupid? But it's just Kyrie knew that him saying that was going to be an extra dig at the franchise and at the city that he left, because he knew that he's going to face the ire of the Boston crowd for the first time. But the level of it and what exactly he's going to face after all these years of it building up, I understand why he said it. But people were saying some offhand things to Trae Young while he was playing, and it got even worse after they lost the first game. He got spit at, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And then Russell Westbrook is injured. He's injured. He's being brought to the back for treatment. And during that, he gets popcorn dumped on him. Like, it boggles my mind that the best behaved crowd during the playoffs last night was Utah.
Well,
Like,
we found out today that wasn't the case.
oh,
We just didn't hear about it.
some people got thrown out.
2 people have been banned for life from Utah games. You'll be surprised to know.
Yeah. So, okay. So someone tweeted me that 2 people did get banned, and I didn't know if they were talking specifically about the Utah game. It's just that it wasn't caught on camera.
This was in this series, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, man. But the connotations of what Kyrie said hit extra hard because he's talking about Boston, and Boston has this long track record, and people who are not from Boston, who are from other fandoms, automatically associate Boston with being what? Racist. And being a black Bostonian, I have people that are afraid to come to Boston because they think it's going to be like Selma in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And Boston has done next to nothing to change the way people think about this. Like, they pretty much have to come visit me, and I have to take them on a tour and have them meet people and pretty much have them show them Boston 2021, you know? And they are afraid every step of the way that, you know, some guys from Southie who are dressed in jack boots and leather jackets are gonna, you know, do things. And I'm like, if anybody says anything, I knock them out and they're left on the street bleeding. Like, what do you, like, they have no clue what Boston is like or what my experience in Boston is like, you know, and that has a lot to do with Boston, and it's Boston's fault. And I have to do a lot of work, you know, we have to do a lot of work to drag Boston across the finish line, kicking and screaming. And then if our work does actually finally, you know, pan out, they're going to take credit for it.
So, and this is what's so frustrating about it, because you speak about the work you have to do, but there's other various players around the city, and you would almost consider the Celtics chief among them in changing that image and pushing back on that and just at least addressing it. For Ainge to completely just throw it aside today and just avoid the question or whatever his attempt was there in saying that I've never heard about it, because again, this is a team that banned a fan from the stands in 2019, 2 years ago, for calling DeMarcus Cousins the N-word.
Yeah.
You've never heard it, but you've heard of it. And you could have chosen either one of those routes to discuss the issue here. And instead, you chose the route where you have to say nothing about it. I was frustrated that no one asked Brad Stevens about it today. Because, you know, of course they're going to ask Tatum. He says how he feels about it. Smart says how he feels about it. I mean, these are the people that have to deal with it. The people who are in power here,
and
who have the ability.
Brown?
Brown didn't talk today.
Okay.
It was just Tatum and Smart. So then you had Brad. No one asked him. But, I mean, this is a guy who's, you know, management here, essentially, in the organization. I would have asked if I had the chance today, how are the Celtics responding to this? You know, what are they going to do in terms of addressing this notion that Boston's a racist city? And even if it's not, why isn't it? Like, it just wasn't addressed by the Celtics organization as a whole. Not even a statement put out there. And that's frustrating to me, because when we talk about changing the image, as you do, I mean, the Celtics are one of the most sought after brands in Boston as a whole. Like, they basically build the brand of a city with how they address and interact with the city.
It's disappointing, right? Because I guess, unfortunately, they feel like you kind of have to take it on the chin in a sense, right? And Danny Ainge, unfortunately, doesn't want to throw the fans under the bus before the first game that we have in, you know, the place in the real playoffs, you know, but like, yeah, it shouldn't be a wild request to be like,
all he had to say
to not be racist.
We hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah,
he had to say 5-6 words. We hope that doesn't happen.
But like, that's the bare minimum, right? It's the bare minimum to ask the fans of an NBA franchise to not do, even though they really, really, really despise one of the players. Well, not maybe one more than the others on the team, because Lord knows they're not super fond of Harden, right? But
Yeah.
Kyrie was here, and the thing is that I was watching videos on YouTube and a couple on Twitter, and there were guys like trying to clear it up. No. This isn't why we have issue with Kyrie Irving. It ain't because he's black. It's because he did X, Y, and Z. It was like, none of those are helping. None of those are helping. So it's kind of a you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't situation. But still, the Celtics should feel the need to make a statement, about what they expect from their fans, what they expect, from people who come to these games, what they expect for their players, and how they should treat the opponent, the bare minimum thing you want from the fans. And, the city of Boston has its own reckoning to deal with in terms of racism and how it's perceived. And I feel one of the main things that needs to happen is we need to change the perception of Boston, because we have to change the visibility of non-white Bostonians and tell the story of our experience. Because when you look at how Boston is depicted, all of it points to every reason why people wouldn't believe the Celtics and would would absolutely side with Kyrie and not want to hear any Boston Celtics fan or anybody who was around when he played, or hear any of their takes on why they have issue with Kyrie. As far as I'm concerned, like, it's not even about basketball anymore. And Kyrie was like, I hope you keep it about basketball. It's really not about basketball anymore, because, the Celtics, for the most part, are completely overmatched in this series. And if they come out in game 3 and get killed, it's going to dig a heel even further. But, like, there's no excuse for fandom to go to the fans to go to the extreme, just take the L. But Boston can't take the L, whether it comes to racism, whether it comes to the perception, whether it comes to the series, right? And, or, for some, losing Kyrie. Did we lose Kyrie? Kyrie left. Like, I almost feel like the other component is that how Kyrie left and what happened afterwards, right? Because the Celtics go from Kyrie immediately to Kemba, and they were looking like world beaters at the beginning of the season without him, right? Then in the postseason, he's not 100%. Gordon Hayward gets injured, and they run into a buzzsaw in the Miami Heat. Now, how different would things have been if the Celtics were in the NBA Finals last season?
The Celtics wouldn't be getting booed the way they were this year. And that's what I find interesting about it, too, is they're going to forget Kyrie, forget the Nets. If the Celtics go down 20 in that first quarter, Kyrie's going to be able to sit back and relax, because they're going to be booing Tatum and Smart and Kevin in the locker room, as we've seen numerous times this year.
Yeah.
And I think that's what fans find frustrating about this, because, the pushback to accusations of racism are always going to be, this isn't about race. But in this facet, it truly isn't. I think that's where, like, it really gets ramped up for people, because they want to boo Kyrie because he left. They want to just let him have it, because they still haven't had that opportunity in full force, as the stadium's going to be full over the weekend. So people are preparing for this in a specifically non-racial way, to just blow them away with boos. Some people are going to take it too far, but most of the people just want to go. The boo is a beautiful thing. I love the boo, and they don't do it in Europe. That was one of the most frustrating things. I went over there. They whistle, which I just think is absurd, but the boo is great. You can boo anybody. Dissatisfaction, there's nothing that goes along with it. Now, anything else people are going to shout at him, you could push that in this direction, but this is where it gets complicated, because we know Boston isn't treated unfairly when it comes to their racial history, because it's true. Everything that's there is true. It's fair. It's in bounds. Yes, even if the motive that Kyrie's going at here, possibly trying to disarm the fans, which he's not going to be able to do, even if that is his motive, that pales in comparison to what he's actually addressing here. What I'm saying now is, when it comes to the fans and what they're going to say here, there is subtle racism, and those are the two words in his commentary that really hit home to me and made me feel like he has a point here. Subtle racism in the way he's addressed. Because what does that mean to you? I mean, to me, it can involve the way people respond to his desire to get into political conversations. It can go back to the microscope that he's under and
so
how every single word that he says is broken down, and oftentimes he is treated unfairly. It can be the dehumanizing nature that we treat athletes with a lot of the time. There's a lot of things that go into this. Like, people hear racism in the crowd and they think like it's just N-words being thrown down, and it's just
they only see it in one. They only see it in one form, right?
Explicit versus implicit here. Yeah. I look at how he was treated for burning the stage earlier this season, and that really sticks out to me because just the vitriol he was met with when he legitimately, within the last year or two, is trying to dive into his own Native American heritage. This is a very new thing for him. He's self-discovering. Yes. I mean, these are valid things he's doing as a person, and ways of expressing himself that shouldn't be brought into the vitriol and this hatred of him that should be strictly basketball, as he says it is. But you have people on Twitter, after seeing him burn the stage just insanely mad, saying kick him out of the building. One guy says call the fire marshal. And that's the subtle racism that gets pointed at him, because again, he sees this, he hears this, everybody does. And so that, to me, is the fair statement that he makes there, because this isn't just about fans going into the stadium and booing him, or some out of bounds fans throwing the N-word at him. There's a over magnification of everything he's done. How many athletes have left Boston? Johnny Damon, Jacoby Ellsbury. You can throw others out there, with more perspective here. The fans are really mad for a year, and then they get over it. We have the pandemic and thing that has kind of delayed it here, but I feel like this Kyrie thing is going to drag out much longer than a typical player leaving a city would. And that, to me, is where that subtle racism comes in.
See, when we talk about subtle racism in terms of sport, right? Howard Bryant and I had this discussion years ago when we talked about what went wrong with the Celtics' pursuit of Anthony Davis. One, it was public. Danny Ainge publicly stated that he was going to go after Anthony Davis, right? Mistake. Another thing was to talk about the assets that they had to be best in line to acquire Anthony Davis, right? So what you're doing is you're instantly equating real humans playing a sport for your team and your franchise as assets.
See, right? That's something I've evaluated within the last year, because that's part of this dialogue of sports. And I'm not the only one that's guilty of it. I feel like everybody who's written about sports has described an athlete as an asset.
Yeah, and here's what's crazier, right? My finger. When you think about that, and think about what was going on that whole season, right? Everybody was playing that year knowing that it was likely that they'd be out the door for Anthony Davis if they could get him, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about the whole season. We're talking about Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum. No, you can't get rid of him. You can't touch Jason. You can't touch Jaylen. Al's the biggest piece. Al can go at any time. If we're gonna get him, he's definitely gonna be the piece. And they're just talking about everybody else. Would you send Marcus? You can't send Marcus. Marcus is the heart and soul of the team. All season long, they're talking about who you would send, or who you would trade, or what picks you would send along with them. Don't send that pick. All season long. So Jason and Jaylen have to deal with this for a full year, as does Al Jefferson, right? And then the other pieces that when he finally says, I'm not going to Boston, I don't like the way y'all treated IT. Boston, people in Boston, myself, were just like, IT was never going to get that Brinks money. They were never going to give that money to a 5'9" guard to play in a style that isn't Boston Celtics basketball, unfortunately. But that doesn't change that the league loved IT. And the only reason that people really messed with the Celtics during that short stretch of time is because they were rooting for him. But again, as we know in Boston, that's not how we play Celtics basketball. When the Celtics were IT and he was the king in the fourth, they were pretty much playing the same style of basketball that the Philadelphia 76ers played in 2001, right? That's not how the Celtics play. The Celtics have a team where multiple people are dangerous. Ideally, all 5 players on the court are dangerous. That's how the Celtics want to play ball. And I knew that the Celtics were going to upgrade at every point, at every roster space in that offseason. And they ended up doing it. They got rid of their 5'9" point guard. They got rid of their 6'2" shooting guard, who was also one of the best, perimeter defenders in the league in Avery Bradley. They upgraded the bench. They upgraded their starters. The only person who was probably still left around was Al and the guy who they drafted, who was Jaylen Brown, right? And they upgraded everywhere. And that team did what? Went right back to the Eastern Conference Finals. And almost, went to the goddamn finals. But the thing is that when you have players on your team and they're seriously looked at as property, when Terry was tearing things up and he was scary Terry, right? He knew that there was no way he was going to get the money that he was deserved, or he was going to be shipped out of town for somebody else. So do you remember what Terry did in order to get shipped out of Boston and be put in an advantage situation in Charlotte? I do. That man went on ESPN.
The day after the season, pretty much, yep.
And when he went on ESPN, I was like, I respect it. Now, here's the thing. Were people mad at Terry when he got out of Boston? No, because they knew what he was up against. And they knew what he did, and they respected it. And they knew that Puma was going to throw the money at him, and they knew that Scary Terry was going to be Scary Terry somewhere else. And he is. And Charlotte, right? But look at how Kyrie leaves. Kyrie leaves under a set of circumstances that just boggles the mind. But also, I have to tell you, from talking to people who were around the franchise during that time, it was just ugly all the way around, right? Al Horford likely left the Celtics because he did not want to come back to that team if Kyrie was going to come back. But the thought was maybe Kyrie could convince somebody to come back with him. Kyrie had already planned on what he was going to do with KD, And there's the video of Kyrie talking to KD at like the All-Star break. And he's talking about what they could do together. And you could read his lips. And you're like, oh, maybe he's trolling. Maybe he's trolling to try to make people think he's going to do X, Y, and Z. And I was even in denial. You could go and check Twitter. I was like, come on, Kyrie's too smart to do that where he knows there are cameras saying these things that you can really read on his lips. The both of us can go there and do X, Y, and Z, right? But he did. And I really think that that was part of the thing, because after that happened, everything went downhill. The Milwaukee series, they swept the first series. The Milwaukee series was a mess. A mess. And then, look at his reactions. He pretty much quit on the team after game one when they won. When you asked him questions, he just wasn't responding like he typically did. He had checked out already, right? He was gone. And the thing is that if you hate the Celtics and hate Boston, yay. One of your favorite players is no longer wearing green. You would have hated for Kyrie to sign back with the Celtics. You would hate for LeBron to sign with the Celtics. You always want LeBron to go against the Celtics and not the Celtics out. So this is what we're dealing with. But the thing is that the Celtics and Boston City are in a unique situation where it's pretty much like, what can you do? I'm a black Bostonian, and me saying anything positive about my home, the city I've lived in for 45 years, going on 46 this August, I love this city. I bleed green. Whatever color the Celtics, Red Sox, Bruins are. I watch Bruins playoffs games. All right, I am a Bostonian. Even though, when you think of Boston, you automatically don't think my face. It doesn't matter. I exist, right? But the thing is that Boston and the Celtics are in a unique situation where you just pretty much just got to take it. You know, you just pretty much got to take it because nobody wants to hear it. They just don't. They just don't. And I'm disappointed, just like you are, that the Boston Celtics haven't made a statement. I guess they feel like they're feeding into it if they do it.
So that's the thing here. There's a basketball aspect of it that we truly understand. Why does Kyrie do this? Is there a deeper motive here? That could be the case. You know, like try to defang the fans here, get it set up so people second guess booing them or anything like that. So they certainly don't want to play into that notion, I guess. But at the same time, the issue at hand here is so real and the perception is so strong. Forget what Kyrie said. Let's leave Kyrie out of this for a second. Kevin Durant standing next to him when Rachel Nichols asked the follow-up question, you know, have you ever dealt with anything like this in Boston? And Kevin Durant, before Kyrie can even say anything, saying the whole world knows.
Yeah.
Is that a perception that exists around the NBA? I asked Tatum that today. He didn't. I asked too many questions at once. It's that damn Zoom thing. You got to ask 3 questions at once, and the guys probably forget one of them. But he didn't say anything about that. I think that could actually be the case, that people around the NBA, you talk about Horford leaving, who knows if that was even part of Kyrie leaving. It was probably lower on the list. As you said, he didn't mention these things as he was here. But for Kyrie and Kevin Durant, 2 of the most popular figures in basketball today, to stand up there in unison and basically just denounce Boston as a city, as a place to play, is a very powerful statement when it comes to the basketball team and just the branding of the city as a whole. Forget the basketball team. I saw people asking, will this impact the Celtics' ability to sign free agents?
Well, okay, let's talk about that real quick, right?
I don't think that matters as much, but go ahead.
Name every big name black free agent that the Boston Celtics have signed. When they were young and it mattered, not when they were at the tail end of their career. Howard Bryant, but John Bain and I had this very same conversation. Go.
So this is, I'm going to ask you this actually, because I don't know if this matters to you, because you're obviously Honduran background, Latin America. Mm-hmm. Al Horford coming here as a black man, but as a black Dominican man. Obviously, there's a community here, a wide community here of Dominican background and just Latin American background. That's different from a black American, like is there a difference there to you?
See, the conversation is that exactly, right?
Yeah.
Because when we were talking about baseball and they were talking about black participation in Major League Baseball, the discussion was about black Americans and not including black Latinos. I'm a black Latino. Hi, everybody, we exist, right? But the thing is that I include Al Horford, but you know what that makes the list? One. That's insane, right?
Yeah.
And then you're like, wait, how could that happen? Well, because the way the Boston Celtics are set up, that's not how they kind of build or operate, right? Because they got Kevin Garnett in a trade. They got Ray Allen in a trade before they got the trade to get Kevin Garnett, right? And getting Ray Allen and having already drafted Paul Pierce in 1998 when he fell to them is how they got to be in a situation to even acquire Kevin Garnett. But what young black free agent who was entering free agency and had the opportunity to come to Boston has done it? The answer is 0. The first person who was not like on their last leg of their career looking for the championship and came to Boston willingly was Al Horford. And then the very next free agent signing they had, who they were up for, was they signed Gordon Hayward, who couldn't stay healthy, right?
Well, you know what's interesting is Durant was very close. He was right there.
So here's the thing with Durant, right? When Kevin Durant had his meeting with Boston, right? I'll never forget.
Oh my God! Yes, I know what you're gonna say.
I'll never forget the picture of who's trying to woo Kevin Durant to come to Boston.
Let's name them off.
For the Patriots.
Oh Jesus!
And one of the guys is Kelly Olynyk.
Danny Ainge, Tom Brady, and was Isaiah there?
Oh, I think IT was there.
Yeah, I gotta pull up that picture.
But here's what's crazy about it, right? Too, the way they tried to sell him on coming to Boston is that we found the formula to stop the Golden State Warriors. And if you come play with us, the sky's the limit. And if you want to know the facts, the Boston Celtics were the team that had figured out a way to slow down or to compete with the Golden State Warriors, given they didn't have the roster. You know, they didn't have the talent to compete with them in the traditional means. And if you go back and look, whenever they were on a win streak, when people were like, so who do you think's going to have a shot to, you know, beat the Warriors? It was always the Celtics for whatever reason. And when we think of, yes, there's the picture. You see Marcus
We
Smart.
got Brady. We got, I think that's Pagliuca, one of the owners. We got Ainge. We got Olynyk in his tie-dye shirt.
Yes.
And we got Marcus Smart, I guess,
Marcus
was
Smart
there.
was
I
there.
think IT was there too, but he
Yeah.
wasn't in this picture.
So, like, when you think about that, right, you're like, wow, hold on a second. So, to have Kevin Durant say that, and then, of course, like, the meeting, Kevin Durant ended up going to Golden State, and it's funny because the NBA was Golden State. Commentators were really angry. Basketball analysts were really angry. And at the time, I didn't understand why. To me, it made sense why he made that decision. But even though he went there, he was the finals MVP, right? Multiple times? Twice?
Yep. 2 in a row.
People hold that.
All-time performances, too.
Yes. And people hold it against him for playing with that team and winning. So now he has to go somewhere else and win. But when he goes to Brooklyn, it's another super team that's loaded, you know? So it's like, are you going to hold that against him too? Like when the Celtics won and regarded as one of the best teams 35 years ago, that was a loaded squad, buddy. Like you have an all-time great at point guard. You have an all-time great at center. You have an all-time great at power forward. You have an all-time great backing them up. Coming off the bench, you won the six-man award. You have an all-time great at small forward. And then there's Danny Ainge, whose number should be retired by the Boston Celtics. His 44 should be retired. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
It absolutely should be. And the fact that it hasn't been is, I don't get it. But
it'll go up. It will.
Yeah, but Jesus Christ. And his comments about I've never heard. Come on, man. Really? Buddy. Pal.
Probably the absolute worst thing you could say, besides the guy on the radio saying Kyrie's the real racist, but that's the lowest bar.
Also, this is why I'm 45 years old, and I stopped listening to Boston sports radio around 2003, between 2003 and 2005, which is nuts because think about what happened during those years. The Patriots, the Red Sox, like what was happening.
That's the other thing about Boston when we talk about how it digs its own hole.
Yeah.
The Boston media, we talk about this all the time with the Celtics, and I see it firsthand. They're not a tough brass. Like they are not grilling players and just on top of them all the time with tough questions and this and that. It's quite the opposite. The radio is what people are talking about a lot of the time when they talk about the Boston sports radio or Boston sports media. But at the same time, the people are consuming it at a high level and keeping it rolling.
Which is insane because it's a quagmire, right? It's like a landfill. It's a landfill, and like I can't imagine listening to Boston sports radio of your own volition, of your own choice. I can't imagine it. How do you do that? I couldn't listen to a bunch of old, bitter white guys talk about sports with like zero understanding or nuance all day long. Like, if you look at the people who I interact with in the Boston sports media space, like, it is a wide range of voices and things, and we are all away from that in every way you can imagine. You know, like none of us even mess with it unless like we're clowning it. You know, like we have Gary Washburn covering the Celtics, right? And you have, you know, people that have grown up here their entire lives, love the team, and under no circumstances would they even pay any attention to some of the most supposedly prominent people and their take on the Celtics. Like, if Bill Simmons has anything to say about the Celtics, I'm immediately like, nobody cares, right? But to the general public, like, he's the guy, or like, it's weird. It's so weird when I think about like Boston sports media and how like the people who want to be fans feel like they have to tune them out in order to actually be fans. Can you imagine?
Mm-hmm. It's so. I mean, to bring this back to Kyrie, the three layers here. I think this one goes back to what you do a lot of work in. We got his motives and just the benefit of the doubt to the statement that he made. We have the denial in Boston, but somewhere in the middle, we talk about this work of changing the perception about Boston and just how important that is, because it really is stunning. I talked to a lot of people. I obviously met people from everywhere when I went out to Syracuse, and none of them know what it's like in Boston in terms of demographics, in terms of just how the face of the city is transformed. And I think about it all the time now with a lot of the stuff that you've written and talked about in recent years. The only thing, I don't know if you've seen any other examples recently that make you a little bit encouraged about it. The only thing I've seen that actually seems to be working on that was that rollout of the Red Sox jerseys, the marathon jerseys there. There's a great ad just of like a bunch of different people wearing those jerseys, like talking about their fandom, different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, that kind of thing. That has to be the only thing that comes to mind in terms of mass media. You can talk about movies, you can talk about music, all these other things that really just like held down Boston. And that's like within the last year.
And you want to talk about how that came about. So a bunch of my people, a bunch of my friends and associates.
Oh, so Dart was behind it, of course.
Were involved in that campaign, which was beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the first campaign of that nature happened with for Boston, now called the Label, when me, Sean, and some other guys who were in the office, we used to always go to the office, a whole bunch of different people, go to the North End, hang out in that For Boston office at 148 Salem Street, hang out. We used to talk about how all these Boston-based brands were just dropping the ball in terms of storytelling, in terms of representation, in terms of the people that they brought on to do certain ad campaigns, and in terms of how they build a certain product, and in terms of everything. Like, why wasn't this person involved? Why didn't they reach out to this person? This person's right there in their backyard. Why couldn't they got them? What are they doing? So what did we do? We did our own campaign. We did our We Are Boston campaign for Boston, and the commercial got aired during the playoffs and then subsequently several times afterwards. And what happened around Boston? It got bitten by everybody.
Wow.
The Celtics did a version. Sam Adams Beard did a version. All these other people were doing their little versions. And we would just sit there like, wow. Like, if the Celtics wanted to like hit us up, we were right down the street. We could throw a rock and hit the Boston Celtics office. When we made the Dedrick Irving and Reggie Lewis jerseys, right? For the Celtics, we had two of our friends sit front row during a playoff game wearing them, right? We wanted to give one to Kyrie. We went to the Celtics publicists, went to everybody. We couldn't get one to Kyrie. It's his dad's jersey when he played at Boston. When he played at Boston University, we did a throwback. So much work. We had Avenue, who's a Boston rapper from my neighborhood, in the campaign. We had so many people involved. We tried to get Cousin Stiz. We ended up getting Hefe Replay. We had so many people involved in these different campaigns, right? We had Bruins, we had Patriots, we had neighborhood people, we had neighborhood celebrities, we had everybody involved in this campaign for We Are Boston from every walk of life, right? And people saw that. We had Millie's in for the Cambridge drop we did, and we did for Patrick Ewing. We had Patrick Ewing's nephew with Millie's in the campaign representing Cambridge. We did so many things, right? And then I did the original voiceover for the We Are Boston campaign. But what happened was during the time we were going back and forth because we were going to release I'm wearing the shorts right now. The shorts say Hilltoppers, right? Mm-hmm. So this is Durfee. And you know who the superstar Durfee was. So we actually reached out to him in his campaign, Chris Herron. And we did a Chris Herron jersey. And it went crazy. And we were like, wait a second, could you do the overdub or could you do the voiceover for our We Are Boston campaign? So the voice went from being me to being somebody who everybody in Boston knew his voice, Chris Herron. Mm-hmm. And who was going to be on ESPN for doing, you know, a movie, you know, talking about his addiction and stuff. Like, it's a full talk that he has with people about his life and his addiction and stuff like that. And
yeah, he came to my high school. He's come to everybody's high school around Boston.
What's crazy is they used the promo picture they used was from our campaign. Was from the Boston Legends campaign. So that whole thing is something that, you know, kind of started with me and my friends.
So what's that say to you, that there's grassroots work? That's a fairly common thing, but for that to be happening, and I compare it to the Nets, and I haven't studied the Nets and the outreach that they've done extensively in Brooklyn, but just from like a far back view, I see the kinds of things they're doing with letting people into the arena at lower prices. They had half off playoff tickets to like really let just like a diverse group of people into these playoff games. I love the crowd shots in game one of just the different kinds of New Yorkers that were in the stands at that game. And it was a great crowd. I was at game two that was there for that. And that fan base has just been kind of derided over time as weak and just a low-level franchise. But for them to be working on this in terms of branding, in terms of outreach, the way that they appear to be doing it, since they started in the early 2010s, the Brooklyn Nets get started. Their branding wasn't that great in that early incarnation. They had Jay-Z on the sidelines. They had some black and white jerseys. But now just, I look at the court and just how it reflects the neighborhood and just their ad campaigns and being there in the stadium. They had a halftime show with a local rapper. They had performers throughout the game, like every single time out. I didn't love it. It was a bit too noisy and too many lights flashing in my face for that. But I look at what they're doing there from just an interaction with the community standpoint. It's a very powerful thing. And I think it's going to be hugely effective in terms of them eventually trying to compete with the Knicks in their own area of New York.
Yeah.
To hear like the Celtics scooping up the kind of grasswork thing you and other Bostonians are doing and not having your faces and like the people you originally planned for behind that, that's frustrating. And that's the kind of thing we talk about here.
I mean, in a sense they have, but you know, they just don't. Again, being a franchise that's been around since 1946, I guess they don't feel the need to push it to the front. I've been to you know, Boston Garden several times with groups of people, you know, from the neighborhood or from the community or what have you. You know, I still get the offer to, you know, get season tickets, which I didn't think made much sense during the pandemic. I was in a group of people that were in the arena to watch them play the Lakers when they beat the Lakers right before the pandemic, you know, shut everything down. You know, my boy, pro-black Rob Gibbs, who's a prominent Boston graffiti artist and just artist in general, who also has a residency at the, you know, Museum of Fine Arts. You know, he's been in the Boston Globe, all over the media and stuff like that. He was given an award by the Boston Celtics. I have that picture saved in my phone. You know, like, they've done things. It's just that when you're a young franchise and you're trying to get out from under the thumb of the New York Knicks, you know, you tend to do things. And also when you kind of gentrify the neighborhood to exist in the Barclays Center, you know, you kind of have to do things to, you know, win the people over.
Yeah.
If you've been to Boston Celtics, you've been around for 75 years. Do you feel the need to do the same thing? You know, that's the issue we're dealing with here, right? When you're entrenched and you're the only game in town, somebody got to pull you to the side and be like, these are the opportunities you're missing out on. But somebody has to pull them to the side and say, these are the opportunities you're missing out on. Unfortunately, the people who do that are me.
And unfortunately, it feels like despite the Ainge comments today and just the way they approach this, there are going to be Black Bostonians and people who just support them because it's home, because it's
Yeah.
their team, which,
And
you
then there's
know,
going to be
is
people from the outside who say that we shouldn't do that. You know, when the Patriots were going to the Super Bowl all those times, right after Tom Brady was seen having
with
the
the
Trump
MAGA
hat
hat.
and
Yeah.
the MAGA hat in his locker, we caught hell for that, for being Patriots fans. And I'm like, you live in a place where your owner is a Republican and donated to Trump. But Trump is also a friend of our owner too. So it's like the dissonance, right? Things aren't connected. But again, being a Black Bostonian, we're going to have to deal with it on multiple levels, man. And it's like there's so many wars that you just can't win. And unfortunately, I feel like the Boston Celtics feel like saying anything, doing anything almost feeds into what Kyrie said. But the thing is that what Kyrie said and the fact that everybody is like, yeah, Kyrie, even though the man was a flat earther a couple years ago, doesn't that tell you something? Doesn't that tell you there's a problem here? Like, that should tell you there's a problem here. And to actually actively deal with it as opposed to brushing it under the rug like it's going to go away, because it won't, and it hasn't.
This is the final thing I want to hit on here, and this is so key because you talk about the difference of Durant saying one thing, having never been in Boston outside of games probably, and Kyrie, who lived here for 2 years. I don't know where he lived in the city.
Yeah,
I don't know what kind of interactions he had with the city.
I don't either.
But if you're here for 2 years, you have to have some idea of what Boston is.
Well,
whether
you
it's
would
just
likely have to know because your dad lived here.
and not on
for
top of
5
it,
years,
yes.
and your parents met and lived here when you were conceived. You know, I mean, not when he was conceived. Lived here, and
He was born in Australia, yeah.
You know, and like the first school that offered him a scholarship was Boston University. Kyrie used to come here to do camps and stuff like that. His dad brought him, right? Dread is what everybody knows his dad is, right? Mm-hmm. I grew up watching this man on TV, and if you go looking on YouTube, go look for any Boston University games with him in them, you won't find anything. You'll find nothing. Crazy. Played in NCAA versus Duke. Good luck finding the footage. I've hit up Duke, heard nothing back. Because we were going to do
Duke's PR. Good luck. Oh,
yeah,
I gotta
do a documentary. But the thing is that Kyrie, right? He knew what he was saying when he said it. He knew that
and that's where it's so hard.
That could be done. It is what it is. Unfortunately, again, the Celtics and Boston City might just have to take this on the chin. And I'm on Twitter, and people go through my old tweets, and they just say whatever about me without knowing anything about me or my 13 years on Twitter or my life's work as a Black Bostonian. And they just jump to a conclusion. Why? Because they're Kyrie fans and they hate Boston and they hate the Celtics. And anything else doesn't matter. So I had to delete a tweet, which wasn't even something that I should have had to delete. But I just did it because of harassment. So here's where we are, right? Should the Boston Celtics have said something, made a statement about what Kyrie said? Yes. Should anybody in the Boston Celtics have tried to brush it off like what Kyrie says didn't happen or it doesn't exist in any way, shape, or form? No. Should the Boston Celtics and the city of Boston have actively been like, look, we need to address these things. These things happen. They're very valid, what Kyrie said. And then probably go to the fans, go, Jesus Christ, like, good luck with this. And be like, look, we know the Celtics are likely going to get murdered. We might get swept. It might happen here. But for the love of God, don't give anybody any kind of ammo or have them be able to point and be like, see, I told you. Because you know what's going to happen? Even if nothing happens and everything goes off without a hitch and there are no incidents, people are going to be like, oh, the only reason the Boston fans behaved is because they were put under this microscope and scrutiny. And if anything happens, you know what people are going to do? They're going to point and say, see, I told you that's what Boston's like.
And yeah, this is where
So,
it gets difficult because you're either pro Kyrie or you're against Kyrie, and it's a lot more gray here, this discussion we're
yeah.
having.
And the unfortunate part is that gray doesn't matter. It is what it is. I want Boston to be better. I wish the Celtics would do something more. I feel like after the series is over, they're going to have to deal with it. And the fact remains that if you're like, this is going to hurt Boston's chances to get free agents, newsflash, the Boston's history and reputation did that way before Kyrie.
So that's the good thing about it, and that's where you probably have to listen to what he's saying, regardless of what you think his motive is. Because again, we have this understanding, especially when you mention rhetoric and BU and that kind of thing. We know that Kyrie knows what Boston is, and he's doing this for a certain reason. But at the same time, it's true. You have to listen to it. You have to grapple with it. And if you're worried about the impact it might have on Boston, it's not Kyrie saying it's fault that exists.
Exactly. This all existed already. Like,
yes,
my 45 years of life, I went to Morgan State University to try to walk on the basketball team for the 95-96 season. I got to Morgan State, which is in Baltimore, Maryland, and I had to explain to people 25 years ago, I left this month 25 years ago, that Black people exist in Boston. Okay? In the year of our Lord, 1996, I had to explain that we existed in Boston. All right? So imagine how people view this city. Imagine the hill we have to climb in order to deal with people's perception of Boston. Imagine how much work Boston has to do. Real work. Real work. And to try to deny anything Kyrie says or try to anything, it's going against what needs to be done, you know? And again, stop crying about he's going to put a black eye on Boston. Boston's had the black eye. It's been there. We've had it.
No, he's not the first person to address it, even in recent years.
No.
And that's Marcus Smart has addressed it within the last few months.
Yes.
And that's why what he said today shouldn't have been all that surprising to anyone, because if you were paying attention, he did a Players Tribune talking about getting pulled over and undressed by a cop essentially for like why you were driving this vehicle. You must be, a musician, you must be a basketball player, this and that.
I remember when it happened. I remember when that happened to D Brown when he first came to town.
Yeah.
He was in like Wellesley or something crazy.
So there you have it. Like, this isn't Cousins has addressed this. Adam Jones has addressed this in recent years. This isn't a Kyrie thing, even though in this scenario it gets highlighted because it's Kyrie. And this is the Kyrie thing at the end of the day. You can hyperanalyze how he's doing everything here and whether you think it's a good cause or a bad cause. But at the end of the day, I do feel like in his own way, he's trying to highlight certain things and certain hypocrisies. And he does end up having a lot of people show their ass on things, which I think is wildly effective. And that kind of troll approach, I think, is very effective in today's media space. Like, this caught a lot more traction. The Adam Jones thing was pretty huge within Boston. This became a national story where everybody's looking at it, and maybe it wasn't gone at in the right way in terms of like putting Boston in the perception it should be. But at the same time, it says to Boston, you got to do something here if you want to change that. And unfortunately, I think what we've seen this week is a massive lost opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. And then again, what happens if the Celtics win game 3? What happens? If the Celtics get blown out in game 3, if the Celtics get swept, if the Celtics win both games in Boston, this goes on, So it's like, either way, Boston, the Celtics organization and franchise really missed out on an opportunity to do something. And the bottom line is they need to do something.
Yeah. And again, I think white people look at this as like, we're losing our chance to boo. Go boo him. Go boo him like crazy. When I was growing up, I would boo LeBron like crazy. I have all the respect in the world for LeBron. But when it comes to between the lines and the ball goes up, it's boo city. You can go do that. All Kyrie asked was don't be racist. And
it seems like a simple request, but we know.
But there's a lot of guilt
not,
there that it brings
yeah,
out. And
you
so
know, it
people
really
get very
is,
angry.
I love this, man. This city, man. This so much, man. So much.
Game 3, when you're hearing this, is tonight. Dart Adams, you can find him on Twitter. He's a gem of Boston, Massachusetts. He's doing amazing work, as he has been for a long time. You can read him in Boston Magazine. The Boston Globe did a story on him as part of their profile of various Bostonians. And you can get the Book of Dart, as I said, as well, with a compilation of his writings. He is great. We always appreciate having him on here. And hopefully we'll start talking to you more often in the years ahead.
Cool.